Hey, John Gilroy here. Now, here's a fun fact for you from data.gov. There are over 250 million data sets being used by public sector. What could possibly go wrong? Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Well, we're in the studio today with Adam Costello. He is the solutions lead architect at Worldwide Technology. And as you heard in the beginning, we're going to talk about data everywhere, and not a bite to understand. Try to figure out what's going on with data in the federal government. I've got all kinds of statistics and facts and everything else about data for the federal government. But today, I want to jump with real quick questions here. You know, in software, we have something called a software development lifecycle. And in data, do we have anything like that, Adam? Or what do we have?
Yeah, we absolutely do. We have controls and retention policies, et cetera, that obviously need to be adhered to across the federal government, as well as continuous delivery of that data to federal government customers.
Good. I want to get some more numbers here to start this conversation off. I was reading a report yesterday. You know, the people in the federal government aren't the only ones who are getting deluged with information. According to a recent study I read, there's like a 25% growth in data year after year for most organizations. That means federal and commercial. 61% of growth in cloud, and a 200% increase in software as a service. So our federal people all around us in D.C. here, they're going through this same growth, aren't they?
They absolutely are. It's exponential, from unstructured data to all sorts of data sources, from applications to backup and controls, and tracking that data and utilizing that data appropriately is absolutely paramount to the future of our agencies across DoD.
You know, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence, and, you know, you can stand at the corner in D.C. and people would come to you and start talking about artificial intelligence. And it's based on data. And I think what people have to understand is that their AI is going to be worthless unless the data that they use is accurate. Is that right?
Absolutely. If data is not normalized and or cleaned, it's not ready to be utilized for appropriately with, you know, whether it's a CMDB or an AMDB. Right? Asset management database or a configuration management database. That is the ultimate truth in reporting module that gives government customers their purpose and the reason to handle the data that is appropriate to their use case.
If you go to the Federal Data Strategy website and look around and read stuff, which I did this morning, a lot of them will say, well, you know, when it comes to data, what you want to do is start at the beginning and find out what your assets are, where they are, where they're located, before you even take the second step. So when you said AMDB, I mean, this is the first step. Where are all your assets? There could be databases located somewhere that you're not even aware of.
100%. There's data everywhere that you're not really aware of. And that's the purpose in having, you know, the configuration management databases and the asset management databases. Ultimately, tools that feed other tools accurate data, normalized, cleaned data, in order to be used for tracking of those assets. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that ends up decreasing and or managing costs across our customer set, which is, you know, obviously the DoD.
Do you have any stories you want to tell about maybe organizations you've worked with and discovered things that they didn't know were even there during one of these searches?
Yeah, so, you know, obviously working across, you know, the Fourth Estate and DISA and the DoD, a lot of the customers, they know that they have some sort of data there, but they're not 100% sure of how that data got there and or how to manage said data. So, you know, some of those customers, you know, they have shares coming off of storage arrays, and those shares have shares off of shares off of shares off of shares, and you get to specific character limits, et cetera, on access, and certain, you know, OEM vendors can provide access to that data on those long path names, or you get to a scenario where maybe it's like ghost IT, right, where there's data in the cloud that nobody really knows about. And that is a sprawl problem that we're trying to control and or understand how to control it appropriately.
I listen to a podcast by Dr. Zero Trust, and he talks about zero trust. It's really important. And I believe it, and I think it is important. But, I mean, if you look at it analytically, you're going to trust a certain person with a database. Well, this is an integral part of the puzzle. What are you going to trust them with?
Right.
A bad database, a duplicate database, a modified database. I mean, got to start at the beginning.
You absolutely do. And, that's ultimately their job, though, right? It's to handle and manage that data. The data in a database has got to be clean. It's got to be good, healthy data to provide, leadership in some sort of fashion, a set of truth, something to lean on, like a fence whenever you're cutting wood in a wood shop. You have to have a flat, level surface in order to start from, and that's it for a database person.
You're just a young puppy. Years ago, before you were in this career, they used to have database managers, and part of their job was deduplicating the database. And, that was possible. 20,000 people, maybe 30,000 people, maybe. We're talking petabytes a day now. And so deduplicating can be an issue all in of itself. I mean, this is one essential step of data management, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. But don't sleep on my age. I'm up there too. But however, the data itself and deduplication and compression, it's all built into, a lot of the storage-based solution sets that are out there. Now, not every piece of data can be deduplicated. Not every piece of data can be compressed or compacted. Image data, video data, things like that. You only get so far from a compaction, deduplication, and compression perspective. So the idea is obviously you have to size appropriately to handle that data, and that data sprawl over a period of time. That takes tools, that takes intelligence, that takes actually managing that data at a controlled fashion that obviously would lead down a path of success.
David Linthicum wrote a book about cloud and cloud management, and he talked about some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses, and he says a lot of companies are pulling back, they're repatriating some of their cloud storage. I think a lot of people are lulled into the cloud and don't realize that they may be paying for much more storage than they actually need, and it goes with backing up too. And so I think maybe 10 years ago, people dazzled with the cloud. They put everything in the cloud, and they realize it's maybe not be the answer or anything, but managing the data can reduce check number one, reduce cloud costs, right?
Right, absolutely. Cloud expansion has really taken off over the last, 5 years or so, especially across the DoD. From the hyperscalers, whether it be, the Googles, the Amazons, the Azures, the whatever cloud vendor that you want to talk about, every one of them is obviously looking at expansion across their footprint, which for them is obviously great. But the more important part for the customer and or the agency themselves is data locality. Where is that data actually located in order to run their applications so that they're not having to pay egress costs in and out of those clouds that ends up being really an expansive cost to the agency when the application could be located in a specific location and not have to pay that.
But let's face it, if we're at dinner somewhere with our friend Malcolm and everyone's talking about artificial intelligence, that's the latest thing in ChatGPT-4, but this data management is kind of, it's kind of like engineering. It's doing the basic math, blocking and tackling and making sure that your money is used efficiently. It's really the basics here, isn't it? I mean, this is what we're talking about. And we can talk about this ChatGPT, but that data's got to be strong.
That data absolutely has to be strong. It's very, very, very important. And that goes back to the data locality conversation, making sure that data is in the right place for the right application and managing that appropriately. And when we have scenarios like Ghost IT, that does actually happen, and agencies not really 100% sure where that data is at, the problem is pulling that back under control.
And goes back to the AMDB, finding where the ghost is.
Yeah, 100%.
Who's out there saying, no, I'm going to sign up for the SaaS program. I don't care. I don't care what Adam has to say. I'm going to do it myself. And then bad things happen.
Bad things happen. You can't back it up. You can't control it. And next thing you know, there's a possible breach. Things like that happen. And that's really, really bad in the case of the DoD.
Well, I'm glad you brought up backup. I can use my famous line now. In fact, I might have used it with Malcolm last year. I said, if you don't back up, you'll crack up. And that's a nice thing to say for someone at home or something, or maybe in a school to back up their data. But this whole idea of backing up, it's a major problem in the federal government, because you're not just backing up John's donut data. You may have different types of data with different sensitivities. And how do you back it up to different locations? And oh, by the way, we have a hybrid cloud now, Adam. And by the way, it's changing all the time. And this is It's a multi-dimensional problem we have. Just back it up, Adam. No, wait a minute. Let's have a 3-hour conversation.
Right. So when we get into handling data from a backup perspective, obviously there's a 3-2-1 rule that's been across the industry for a long, long time. And so that 3-2-1 rule really comes into the scenario of, 3 copies of the data, 2 different locations, and 1 offsite. If you think about managing that data, kind of contemplate long-term retention of that data. Snapshots are not backup. They're not. Backup is backup. So you can utilize snapshots to quickly return your infrastructure back to where it might be a period in time before. But, along with different, technologies out there, a lot of them are, trying to be covered under snapshots and not necessarily time-based backups where you're not really just going to roll it back. You need the data in its consistent form from before maybe an infection happened or a corruption happened or something like that. Time-based backups are very, very different than snapshots. Very different.
I've done hundreds of interviews with all kinds of companies, and many of my previous companies listen to these podcasts because they want to see who you can partner with. And I'm just thinking that if someone like you has the expertise to manage assets effectively, you could reduce the cost of a contract just by knowing how to manage the data. Couldn't you? I mean, this is a cost control issue.
Yeah, it's absolutely a cost control issue. From a data management perspective, it's big because, if you don't need, 2 copies of a specific file or a folder or whatever, obviously controlling how much is actually there is a big deal. Now, obviously deduplication and compression help with that, but as I said, a lot of files can't be done like that, whether they're video or pictures or whatever. Now, I mean, that also plays into, overall cost. And from an asset management perspective, if you do have a solid, asset management tool that does what it's supposed to do, then obviously it can go out and dynamically see the data, dynamically see appliances or devices or whatever across the network and see if there are any actual changes or applications that are rogue that maybe have been installed that are running all over the place and growing, installs that have not been approved, etc. A lot of that, it happens. And when you're not protecting that data from a time-based backup, and you don't really have a solid way to go back a month previously or 6 months previously to go get the data that's in solid form, you're really going to cost the agency and or the DoD something to be able to go and actually get that data. You can't get it. So that's another cost, not to mention the man hours to try to go and get that data.
When professional comedians go back to the start of their routine, they call it a callback. I'm going to do a callback here. We start off with this number, 25% growth in data year over year for most organizations. And what if you have a process for backing up data? It's changing as you're deploying it, isn't it?
Yeah. And, in the DoD, a lot of that is encrypted. So when you have an encrypted header on a packet, ultimately you can't deduplicate that. So your backup and your tier 2 storage locations, they're all growing exponentially. That's cost. That's what that ends up being, is big, big cost.
Dynamic changes. I remember when I first moved to town here years ago, I had an old beat-up Honda, and all my worldly belongings were in this Honda. Now, if I were to move, I'd need a moving truck.
Yeah.
Things change. I think some agencies may have policies that may fit one situation maybe 3 years ago, and it works fine, but dynamic changes all the time. I mean, it's almost like your backup practices almost have to be reviewed every 6 to 8 months because it's so much change.
Yeah, I mean, reviewing backup policy on the regular is absolutely key. But also reviewing your data retention policies is also very, very, very important. And what those actually are. Those all report back to an SLA or an RTO or an RPO, and those are paramount to protecting the data as well as being able to continuously keep the agency up and running.
Boy, we could do 3 hours just on retention policies, but we're going to jump. We're going to talk more about pickup trucks and moving vans and everything else.
Sounds good.
Back in those days, when I had all my whirly belongings in my old Honda, I might have used a spreadsheet for managing things. It seems to work. With the size of, back to 25% growth, it outgrows this spreadsheet. So what about automatic tracking? Is that how you do it? Is that how you find out what's going on?
That's the recommended best practice, is to have something that automatically detects, whether it's a rogue install or whether it's an application or if it's a chair, if it's a pound of, ice, whatever that might be, whatever that material might be, being able to dynamically track that and understand where that's physically at may prevent you from having to buy something else to replace it, which ultimately leads to cost that you might not need to take on. If you take that into consideration, the dynamic application of installing licenses and then maybe a user might use a license from a Vizio or whatever it might be, and then they want to reuse that license, or maybe that person only uses that application once a year and somebody else needs that application because they use it once a week. That is a scenario where that user that uses it once a week needs it more than the other person. So instead of buying more licenses, use the license to be reallocated to that user. That ends up being cost over a certain scale, which is massive.
So if people want to get more information, they can go to wwt.com and download a lot of white papers you have on data management. And if you're listening to this, I will put a link to a white paper on data management in the show notes for this episode.
Yes, sir. That's perfect. wwt.com.
I have to confess, I deal with young people all the time, and you hear a lot of, but you don't understand. And I'm sure if you're sitting with someone and saying, automatically tracking, and they're going to say, but you don't understand. There are people that love Excel. I mean, they love Excel. I once knew a company, a young lady worked for a company. They did their newsletter on Excel.
Sure.
They loved it so much.
Yep.
I can't believe it. But sometimes you have to cut the ties, and automating things are the only way you handle with this drastic increase in information everywhere. Excel lovers are going to hate me now after saying that. But you're not the only one who's heard about Excel being used for a newsletter, huh?
No, I've definitely heard about it. I've seen it. And,
wow.
A decimal point 1 or 2 digits over is a very, very big difference.
Wow. Adam, you mentioned the word license, and I flashed on the driver's license and the car and driving here and everything else, but there are software licenses that people are much more interested in, I know that. Lots of money is wasted on software licenses that no one uses. Drives me crazy around the house. Someone in the house may buy something that they never use. I'm not going to name names. We talked about life cycle earlier. So is there some way that this renewal cancellation can be automated? And it applies to Ghost IT. It applies to so many different aspects, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So managing those licenses is a full-time job for someone, especially if they're doing it inside of like a spreadsheet and period of performance has come, to an end after a year or maybe 3 years or even 5 years. Managing that out of a spreadsheet tends to be very difficult. I guess that's the right way to put it. But if you have a device and or an AMDB that's out there dynamically collecting that data and putting that data into a CMDB, which is effectively cleaned and normalized, that provides a lot of functionality and cost savings across managing those licenses. And then also, as I said earlier, the reallocation of those licenses, if you want to do that, is all dynamic as well. Managing whether or not you need that license every day or once a month is, that's a problem in itself. And it's across the DoD pretty rampantly.
Yesterday, I talked with a gentleman from Chicago, and we talked about 5Gs and satellites. And the number of endpoints that are going to explode in the next few years it's incredible. And this is, again, feeding into your database here. More endpoints means more attack surface. Yep. And so, if you can manage the assets, now you're the cybersecurity guy. All of a sudden, you're reducing risk with asset management. I never thought of it that way. It happens, doesn't it?
You absolutely are. So, in the case of utilizing an AMDB that has, maybe agents or the ability to have vision into those endpoints, whether it's on a Windows PC or whether it's on a Linux box or a Mac box or whatever, software installs, etc., they happen. Somebody will go out to a store and buy something, install it, whatever. That may happen, it may not, but not having control of those endpoint devices for software-based installs, etc., is a difficult situation. So for the most part, obviously, DoD has control of that, but not every certain box, every Azure box or AWS box has certain controls on it. Managing those appropriately at scale, you get to hundreds and hundreds of desktops, hundreds and hundreds of servers, etc. Those kind of get to a very difficult scenario of a single person managing and maybe even 2 people managing. But when you have tools like an asset management database that has our agent on it, you can actually see what's installed on those, whether it's approved or not, and you can actually delete it, uninstall it automatically, and that's a cybersecurity threat that you're managing.
We mentioned retention and some regulations involved in reporting for asset management as well. And so I'm just thinking about, you mentioned IT asset management. So what's the best practice here for reporting under IT asset management?
Continuous reporting is the answer to that. And the reason for it is obviously the cybersecurity risk side. That's one of the biggest. And then the other is obviously managing your software-based licenses that are being installed and utilized. The last thing that ultimately an agency wants to have to deal with is a software vendor coming back and saying, checks and balances. You owe me $1 million now because, all these different users are consuming the same license and you haven't paid for it over a period of time. And so controlling that and actually having vision into that is a big deal.
In the military, there's a saying, if you defend everything, you defend nothing. So you have to prioritize. I would imagine with data management, you have to prioritize what you're going to back up, what you're going to cover, what you're not going to cover. In fact, there's a guy named Thomas Sowell who said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs.
Right.
Given the budget constraints here, do you help agencies when they say, look, we want to do this, and to comply we have to do this? And so how does one make the trade-off there with what's good enough, what will comply, what may not comply?
So it's interesting. A lot of that goes back to cost control. And as we all know, with the continuing resolution and everything that, obviously has bled into, over the past year or so, it's come back to, the budget again. And it always comes back to the budget and the budget and the budget, right? Controlling all the assets from an asset management database it's so important in order to be able to provide, vision into what the future looks like for the agency. And I think that's really where the focus needs to be.
There's a phrase I've heard this about 4 or 5 years ago when people are, especially in the cybersecurity world, they talk about one pane to see what's going on in your whole system, And I think many in IT asset management talks about one pane or dashboards. Is this just a silly word to use with these hybrid cloud, this dynamic changing environment, or are there situations where you can put together one pane?
Oh, you can absolutely put together a single pane of glass across, cloud instances and on-prem instances, et cetera. It just depends on the application set that's actually being used from one vendor to another. APIs are typically leaning on REST. And so REST APIs can talk to just about every other platform out there through its line of code. It's absolutely a single pane of glass time for most agencies.
This is a podcast, and podcasters get together. They talk about an RSS feed. It's something that podcast uses to distribute itself over many different networks. And I want to talk about feeds now with the federal government. You mentioned CMDB earlier, which was, I think, configuration management database. So what about these feeds coming into an agency? How do you get control on them?
So the data that's coming into these configuration management databases, it's all over the place. It's being fed in many different fashions for many different applications. And so the reason for the REST API integration is obviously for all these different OEM solutions to be able to talk over a platform and ingest data and then present that data across a reporting platform to someone that is at the financial level and or the chief level to be able to make an intelligent decision on whether or not they need an appliance or a piece of software, a license, whatever it might be. But that platform is very important to the agency and very important to all the OEMs to have a standard to be able to deliver that data to the CMDB.
Okay, if a agency is sitting on a data set, it can be corrupted, it can be modified, there can be unauthorized access. There's all kinds of things can happen. May or may not boil down to data literacy, I think. This is why we're doing this podcast, to let people know different ways to solve problems. So is this an issue of data literacy where maybe you should go around and talk to people about, well, look, get control of your assets. Maybe these things will happen. Data literacy seems to be becoming more and more important here just with the amount of data we're dealing with.
It's very, very different today. Previously, we used to manage protecting the data and handling the data, but we never looked inside of the data as to its consistency and its application set from an infrastructure perspective. We had application vendors that did that. Nowadays, obviously, it's way more important to centralize on the intelligence that's in that data in order to deliver value to the customer. And that goes back to your original statement a while ago about artificial intelligence. And if that data is not normalized and clean, artificial intelligence is useless.
Yeah. So I think the focus is on best data management practices in order to use the power of artificial intelligence. Look into the crystal ball. So where are we going in 5 years?
That's an interesting question. The idea across DoD is to continue and grow the cloud footprint, get out of the data center business, and really focus on application delivery and security. It makes sense to a certain extent. until you get to the point of data locality. And you get into data locality because certain applications need to run on premise and not in cloud. And those applications that are in need to be fast and in need to be really, really centralized about accessing directly from, say, a terminal or whatever that might be, that locality is massive to the growth of where data is going. And that's why it's multi-threaded. It's threaded around cloud workloads, on-prem workloads, and then also multi-cloud and or hybrid cloud as well.
That was quite an articulate answer. Whew. So taking notes here. So Adam, we've been discussing data security here. Where can people learn more?
You can go to the platform at wwt.com. Also, if you're going to be at TechNet Cyber on June 25th to the 27th, be sure to stop by our booth, 3125.
Well, Adam, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Adam Costello, Solutions Lead Architect at Worldwide Technology.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.